12 million gallons of water go over Niagara Falls every single minute. And behind that wall of falling water, in a hollow space carved into the rock itself, Haudenosaunee tradition says, something has been living there since long before anyone thought to build a viewing platform to look at it. Not a fish, not a current, a being powerful enough to kill a monster and reshape the shoreline of an entire river with the body it left behind. This is Niagara Falls, one of the most photographed natural landmarks on the entire continent, visited by more than 12 million people a year, most of whom arrive already thinking they know the story behind it. They don't. And what the Iroquois, more accurately, the Haudenosaunee, the Six Nations Confederacy whose territory this has always been, say is sleeping beneath it isn't the sanitized gift shop version of the story that's been sold to tourists for over a century. It's an older, stranger, and considerably more specific account, one that a Euro-American tourism industry spent generations quietly rewriting into something else entirely. By the end of this video, you're going to understand what the Haudenosaunee actually say lives behind the falls, how a real physical feature of Niagara, the exact shape of the Horseshoe Falls itself, is tied directly to that story, and why the version of this legend most visitors have heard for the last 150 years was deliberately altered by outsiders, for reasons that had almost nothing to do with honouring the people who told it first. This isn't a case of a story simply drifting over time, the way details naturally blur across generations of retelling. This is a documented substitution, with an identifiable source, a clear motive, and a paper trail leading directly into the tourist industry still operating at the falls today. The story centres on a young Seneca woman named Leawala. According to the traditional account passed down through Haudenosaunee oral tradition long before European colonisation reached this region, Leawala had lost her husband and was overwhelmed by grief, the kind of loss that in most tellings of this legend is described as triggering a cascade of further misfortune in her life, until she felt she had nothing left to hold on to. She took a white birch bark canoe out onto the Niagara River above the falls, intending to let the current carry her over the edge. As her canoe was pulled into the rapids, she is said to have sung a death song, letting go of her paddle, accepting what was coming, offering no resistance to the current that was about to decide her fate for her. But she never reached the bottom. According to the legend, He-no, the god of thunder, who lived not somewhere abstract or distant, but in an actual cave behind the sheet of falling water itself, a place the Haudenosaunee call Niagara, caught her mid-fall. He carried her down into his home beneath the cataract, where his sons cared for her, and where she eventually married the youngest of them, finding in that underwater dwelling exactly the kind of purpose and belonging her grief had convinced her she'd lost forever. The thunder beings themselves, known as the hydroelectric in this tradition, are described as powerful sky entities who had made their home in the rock behind the water long before Lelawala ever arrived there. Not minor spirits, but among the most significant forces in Haudenosaunee cosmology, tied directly to storms, to protection, and, in this telling, to compassion strong enough to reach out and catch a woman already resigned to dying. That alone would already be a striking piece of oral tradition, a literal underwater dwelling, tucked into the rock behind one of the largest waterfalls in North America, home to a family of thunder beings the Haudenosaunee call the Haudenosaunee. But the story doesn't end there. And what happens next is the part that connects this legend directly to something you can still see with your own eyes today. Sometime after Lelawala settled into her new life beneath the falls, she was permitted to return briefly to warn her village of a danger she'd learned about from her new family. A massive serpent, according to the tradition, had been slowly poisoning the water supply her people depended on. A slow, invisible threat, killing them gradually rather than all at once, the kind of danger that's almost impossible to notice until the damage is already severe. There was no dramatic attack to warn people away, no visible monster to point to. Just water that looked the same as always, quietly turning against the people who drank it. Lelawala's warning, carried directly from a source no ordinary villager could have accessed, let her people escape before it was too late. The serpent, furious that its prey had gotten away, went looking for them, and its hunt eventually brought it into direct conflict with He-no himself. He-no struck the creature dead with a thunderbolt. And here's where the legend stops being a story about spirits and starts becoming a story about geography. The serpent's massive corpse fell across the top of the escarpment, blocking the Niagara River's original course. The surging water, no longer able to follow its old path, was forced to carve a new one around the dead creature's body, and according to the tradition, that redirected flow is what actually created the Horseshoe Falls, the largest and most recognizable of the 3 cataracts that make up Niagara Falls today. Think about what that claim is actually doing. It isn't simply explaining why a waterfall exists in a general sense. It's naming the exact curved shape of one specific massive geological feature, a shape distinctive enough that it's given its own separate name on every map of the region, distinguishing it from the smaller American and Bridal Veil Falls beside it, as the literal outline of where a monster's body once redirected an entire river. Stand at the railing overlooking Horseshoe Falls today, watching the water curve into that unmistakable arc before dropping away. And the tradition isn't asking you to imagine something abstract. It's asking you to look at the exact shape in front of you and understand it as a boundary line drawn by a dead serpent that the river has been obeying ever since. No other natural explanation offered to tourists at the site attempts anything nearly this specific. Most signage simply describes erosion and geology in general terms, without ever accounting for why the curve takes the particular form it does. The flood caused by that redirection was severe enough in the story that it destroyed He-no's original underwater dwelling, forcing him, Leawala, and their family to abandon their home beneath the falls entirely and relocate to the clouds above, which is why, according to Haudenosaunee tradition, the sound of thunder rolling over Niagara today is understood as the echo of He-no's voice, still audible long after the family that once lived directly behind the water was forced out of it. Every storm that rolls over this stretch of the Niagara River, in other words, is described in this tradition not as weather in the abstract, but as a specific named voice, still calling from the sky he was forced to retreat to. So that's the original story, specific, geographically grounded and tied to real, still visible features of the falls. If that were the version most people knew, this would already be one of the more remarkable pieces of oral tradition connected to any landmark in North America. It has an internal logic that holds up under scrutiny in a way a lot of folklore doesn't. A rescue, an act of loyalty repaid through a warning, a battle with clear physical consequences, and a grief that transforms rather than simply resolving. But it isn't the version most people know, and the reason why says less about the Haudenosaunee than it does about who started retelling their story, and why. Before we get into how that happened, it's worth sitting with just how different these two versions actually are, not just in tone, but in what they claim about the people who told them. One version describes a community protecting a grieving young woman, then benefiting from her love and loyalty when she returns to warn them of danger. The other describes that same community murdering her deliberately, out of fear, to satisfy an angry god. Those aren't two slightly different flavors of the same folk tale. They describe fundamentally opposite relationships between a people and the woman at the center of their story, one built on care, the other built on violence. And only one of them was actually told by the Haudenosaunee themselves. By the mid-1700s, a different version of this legend began circulating among European settlers and travellers, one where Lelawala wasn't a grieving widow who chose the river herself, but a human sacrifice, deliberately offered up by her own people in a ritual meant to appease the god of thunder and prevent his wrath. This version had a specific historical source. Robert Cavelier de la Salle, the French explorer who visited the Haudenosaunee in 1679 for trading purposes, is directly credited by regional historians with feeding the human sacrifice interpretation into wider circulation, decades before it hardened into the version most commonly repeated by the 19th century. It's worth being precise about what LaSalle was actually doing when he told that story. He wasn't a neutral chronicler, recording what he'd heard out of pure historical curiosity. He was an explorer whose entire career depended on continued funding from European royalty, and whose expeditions needed to justify their cost with stories that would capture the imagination of the people signing off on future voyages. A tale of narrowly witnessing or heroically opposing a native ritual sacrifice made for exactly the kind of dramatic, publishable material that kept expeditions financed and explorers celebrated back home. And the timing of that distortion matters. According to accounts collected by local historians, framing indigenous nations as practicing brutal human sacrifice accomplished two very convenient things for the outsiders spreading it. It made for a dramatic story that impressed European royalty funding further colonial expeditions. Nothing secures continued financing for exploration quite like returning home with a tale of narrowly interrupting a native human sacrifice. And it painted the Haudenosaunee as savages, a characterization that made it considerably easier in the eyes of colonizing powers to justify taking their land. A grieving widow accepting her own fate is a tragedy, one that reflects nothing but sympathy on the people who told it. A village sacrificing a beautiful young woman to a vengeful god is a horror story, and horror stories about a people are far more useful to those looking for an excuse to displace them, seize their territory, and describe the whole process afterward as some kind of civilizing mission rather than a land grab. This isn't a minor discrepancy between two roughly similar versions of the same folktale. It's a specific documented act of narrative substitution with an identifiable source, a plausible motive, and a traceable path into the version most people actually encountered for the next 2 centuries. By the 19th century, this altered version had been fully absorbed into the tourism industry growing up around the falls. In 1846, a boat company began operating tours at the base of Niagara and named itself directly after the legend, the Maid of the Mist, a name that endures today as one of the most recognized tourist attractions at the falls, still carrying in its own branding the sanitized and sensationalized version of a story that was never told that way by the people who originated it. Millions of passengers a year board that boat, most having no idea that the name they're riding under represents a deliberate rewrite, or that the woman it depicts wasn't a sacrifice at all, but a griever, saved rather than surrendered. Scholars, native and non-native alike, have since pushed back directly on the sacrifice version, noting there's no actual evidence the Haudenosaunee ever practiced anything like it, and that the original tradition, a woman saved by divine compassion rather than offered up in fear, was, if anything, a story about resilience and healing, not violence. Historians researching the region have specifically pointed to the outsized influence of 19th century American and European fascination with a romanticized, invented image of the Indian princess, as a further reason the false version proved so commercially sticky. It fit a fantasy audiences already wanted to believe, regardless of whether it bore any resemblance to what the Haudenosaunee had actually been telling each other for generations before any of them arrived. A grieving widow saved by compassion didn't fit the exotic, tragic image 19th century travel writers were selling. A doomed princess sacrificed to appease an angry god did, and so that's the version that got printed, illustrated, and eventually sold as souvenir postcards to visitors who had no way of knowing the difference. Local historians, including Donald E. Loker of the Niagara Falls Public Library, have made a point of tracing this exact chain of distortion in detail. Not as a minor historical footnote, but as a documented case study in how a colonizing culture's commercial and political interests can quietly overwrite an entire people's own account of their own sacred landscape and keep that overwritten version circulating for centuries afterward, without most consumers of it ever questioning where it actually came from. So for roughly a century and a half, millions of visitors have ridden a boat named after a legend, without most of them ever learning that the version sold to them at the gift shop was substantially rewritten by the same outside forces who benefited from making the people who actually told the story look dangerous. And there's one more layer to what's happening beneath Niagara Falls today, one that has nothing to do with ancient legend and everything to do with a treaty signed in the 20th century. A modern echo of the exact same pattern that's run through this entire story. Something significant happening just out of view of the millions of people who come to look at the falls without ever thinking to ask what they're not being shown. Under the 1950 Niagara Treaty between the United States and Canada, somewhere between 50 and 75% of the entire Niagara River's flow never actually reaches the falls at all. It's diverted upstream, funneled into massive tunnels, 2 on the American side, 3 on the Canadian side, that carry the water directly to hydroelectric power stations instead, generating more than a quarter of all the electricity used across New York State and Ontario combined. The structure managing all of this, a facility called the International Control Dam, sits upstream of the falls, largely unnoticed by the millions of visitors who drive right past it without realizing it's the reason the waterfall in front of them looks the way it does at any given hour. During the day, in peak tourist season, the treaty guarantees a minimum flow of 100,000 cubic feet per second is allowed to go over the falls, preserving the dramatic, unbroken wall of water visitors expect to see and photograph. After 10 at night, once the crowds thin out, that minimum is cut in half, down to roughly 50,000 cubic feet per second, and even more of the river gets quietly redirected underground into the power tunnels instead. The falls are never actually switched off. The treaty is explicit that an unbroken curtain of water has to keep falling around the clock, but what counts as unbroken has been a carefully negotiated, continuously adjustable number since the middle of the 20th century, not a fixed natural constant. There's a strange kind of preservation hidden inside all of this diversion too. All that redirected water, never touching the falls, means less erosive force scouring away at the rock underneath. Engineers estimate the fall's natural recession rate, once measured in feet per year, has been slowed dramatically by exactly the same diversion that reduces their visual power. In a genuinely strange twist, the very engineering that hides most of the river from view may be the reason Niagara Falls will still physically exist. Roughly where it stands today, centuries further into the future than it otherwise would have, stand at the base of Niagara Falls today at almost any hour, and you are only looking at a fraction of the river that's actually there. The rest is beneath you, moving through tunnels engineered specifically to keep it out of sight, put to work generating power for millions of people who will never see the water that's doing it. He-no's family once retreated from a cave behind the falls into the clouds after a flood destroyed their home. Today, most of the river itself retreats underground before it ever reaches the falls at all, redirected by treaty rather than by thunderbolt, but disappearing from view all the same. So when you ask what the Iroquois said was sleeping beneath Niagara Falls, the most accurate answer isn't really about ancient mythology being proven or disproven by modern engineering. It's about how consistently this landscape has been shaped by things happening just out of sight. A family of thunder beings living behind the water, a monster's body redirecting an entire river, a false story about human sacrifice quietly replacing a true one for the benefit of people looking to justify taking this land. And now, literally, most of the river itself diverted into tunnels the average visitor never thinks to ask about. Layer those 4 things on top of each other, and a pattern starts to emerge that has very little to do with monsters at all. Every single generation that has passed through this landscape, the Haudenosaunee who first told the story, the colonial explorers who twisted it, the 19th century entrepreneurs who commercialized the twisted version, and the 20th century engineers who quietly rerouted most of the river itself, has left something concealed behind the visible surface of Niagara Falls. The only thing that's changed is what's being hidden, and who benefits from visitors never quite finding out. Do you think the original Haudenosaunee legend deserves to replace the Maid of the Mist name that's been built into the tourism industry here for over a century and a half? Or has that name become its own piece of history at this point, worth preserving alongside the story it distorted, as a record of how the falls were once misrepresented, rather than an ongoing endorsement of the misrepresentation itself? Let me know what you think in the comments, and I'll see you in the next one.